I used to think my life was exactly what I had always hoped it would be. Not perfect, but stable in a way that made the little imperfections feel harmless. I had a husband who remembered how I took my tea, a sister who called me her best friend, and parents who never stopped telling people how proud they were of their daughters. From the outside, we looked like the kind of family people envied, close, supportive, always together at birthdays, holidays, and Sunday dinners. My husband, Armin, and I had been married for 3 years. We met at a friend's engagement party, and he had this quiet confidence that made me feel safe almost instantly. He wasn't the loudest man in the room, but he was attentive in ways that mattered. He'd notice when my glass was empty before I did, or when I was getting tired and needed to leave. When he proposed, it felt less like a surprise and more like the natural next step in a story that had already written itself. My younger sister, Sanna, had always been the sunshine of our family. Where I was cautious and reserved, she was spontaneous and charming. People gravitated toward her without trying, and I never resented her for it. If anything, I felt proud of her, like her happiness reflected well on all of us. She was at our wedding, crying harder than anyone else, holding my hands before I walked down the aisle, and whispering that I deserved the kind of love I was getting. For the first couple of years, everything moved in a rhythm that felt comforting. Armin would leave for work before me, kissing my forehead while I was still half asleep. I'd spend my mornings juggling my job and small household routines, and we'd meet again in the evenings to share dinner and stories about our day. On weekends, we often visited my parents, where Sanna would already be there, sprawled on the couch, scrolling through her phone and greeting us with dramatic complaints about being bored. It was easy, familiar, and I never questioned it. The first time something felt off, it was so small that I almost laughed at myself for noticing. Armin had left his phone on the kitchen counter while he went to shower. It buzzed once, then again. I wasn't someone who checked his messages. I'd always believed that trust meant not needing to look. But the screen lit up with Sanna's name, followed by a string of heart emojis. I assumed it was one of her usual over-the-top jokes. She was dramatic like that with everyone. When Armin came back, I casually mentioned that Sanna had texted. He nodded quickly, almost too quickly, and picked up his phone before I could say anything else. I remember how his shoulders stiffened as he read the messages, then relaxed as he locked the screen. He smiled at me, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. I told myself I was imagining things. After that, I started noticing small changes I couldn't unsee. Armin began guarding his phone more carefully, flipping it face down whenever it buzzed. Sanna started visiting our apartment more often, always under some harmless excuse. She needed help with her resume. She was bored at home. She missed me. I was happy to see her, of course. She was my sister. But there were moments when I'd walk into the living room and find them already laughing about something, their conversation stopping abruptly when they noticed me. One evening, we were all sitting together watching a movie. I got up to make tea, and when I returned, I caught a strange silence hanging in the air. Sanna was staring at the TV, but Armin was looking at her with an expression I couldn't quite name. It vanished the moment he noticed me standing there, tray in hand. He quickly reached for the remote, pretending to adjust the volume. "You guys paused it?" I asked, trying to sound light. "No, it's still playing?" Sanna said quickly, too quickly, forcing a smile that didn't match the tension in her shoulders. I told myself again that I was being paranoid. Families were close. Siblings joked with spouses. There was nothing wrong with that. But the unease stayed with me like a quiet echo. A few weeks later, my mother mentioned in passing that Sanna had been dropping by our apartment when I was at work. She said it casually while we were preparing dinner together, as if it were the most normal thing in the world. She says Armin helps her with job applications. My mother said, chopping onions. It's good she has someone guiding her. I froze for a second, knife hovering over the cutting board. I hadn't known she was coming over when I wasn't there. Armin had never mentioned it, and neither had Sanna. When I brought it up to him that night, he shrugged like it was no big deal. She just needed help with some emails, he said. I didn't think it was important enough to tell you. The way he said it made me feel silly for asking. I laughed it off and apologized for overthinking. He hugged me, kissed the top of my head, and told me I worried too much sometimes. That should have reassured me. But instead, it made the knot in my chest tighten. I began paying attention in ways I never had before. I noticed how Santa would text Armin directly instead of messaging me when she wanted to make plans. I noticed how he seemed to know details about her day that she hadn't shared with me. Once, during dinner at my parents' house, she complained about a coworker, and Armin responded with advice so specific it was clear they'd discussed it at length before. They both went quiet when they realized what they'd revealed. The turning point came on a quiet Sunday afternoon. Armin had gone out to buy groceries, and I was folding laundry in our bedroom when I found a receipt in the pocket of his jeans. It was from a cafe across town, one I had never been to with him. 2 coffees, 1 slice of chocolate cake. The date on the receipt was from a Wednesday, during work hours, when he had told me he was stuck in meetings all day. I stared at the thin piece of paper, trying to come up with a harmless explanation. Maybe he had gone with a colleague. Maybe he had just forgotten to mention it. But something in my chest sank with a quiet certainty I couldn't explain. That evening, I asked him about his day that Wednesday, pretending I had forgotten. He repeated the same story about long meetings and an exhausting schedule. I nodded along, forcing a smile, the receipt burning in my pocket like a secret I didn't know how to confront. Later that night, as he slept beside me, his breathing slow and even, I lay awake staring at the ceiling. Every small moment from the past few months replayed in my mind, the hidden phone screen, the sudden silences, Santa's unexpected visits, the way they sometimes looked at each other when they thought I wasn't watching. For the first time since I had gotten married, I felt like a stranger in my own home, surrounded by people I loved but no longer fully trusted. I didn't have proof of anything, only a growing sense that something was shifting beneath the surface of the life I had built so carefully. I told myself I would ignore it. I told myself that good marriages were built on trust, not suspicion. But as I turned onto my side and listened to Armin's steady breathing, a quiet thought settled into my mind, one I couldn't push away no matter how hard I tried. What if the life I thought was perfect was nothing more than a story everyone else knew was a lie, and I was the only one still believing it? The unease that had taken root in my chest after finding the cafe receipt didn't disappear. It grew slowly, like a crack spreading through glass, quiet but impossible to ignore. I went through my days pretending everything was normal, smiling when Armin kissed my cheek before leaving for work, and laughing at Santa's voice notes filled with her usual dramatic complaints. On the outside, nothing had changed. Inside, I felt like I was watching my own life from a distance, waiting for something to confirm the fear I didn't want to name. A week later, that confirmation came in the most ordinary way possible. I had been sent home early from work because of a sudden power outage in the building. It was barely noon when I reached our apartment, the sun still high and the hallway unusually quiet. I remember thinking Armin would still be at the office, and the thought of having the place to myself for a few hours felt like a small relief. I wanted silence, space to think without constantly second-guessing my own thoughts. As I pushed open the front door, I immediately sensed something was off. I could hear voices from the living room, low, hurried, and too familiar to belong to strangers. My heart began pounding before my brain had even processed what that meant. I stepped further inside, my hand tightening around my bag strap, and that's when I saw them. Santa was sitting on our couch, her legs tucked under her the way she always did when she was comfortable. Armin was standing near her, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. They both turned at the sound of the door, their expressions shifting from casual ease to something sharp and startled in a split second. For a moment, none of us spoke. The air felt thick, like it was pressing against my skin. "You're home early," Armin said finally, forcing a smile that looked more like a grimace. Yeah, the office lost power," I replied, my voice sounding distant to my own ears. I looked at Santa. "What are you doing here?" She blinked rapidly, then laughed in a way that sounded rehearsed. "I came to drop off those documents Armin helped me with." I was just about to leave. Her bag was on the floor. Her shoes kicked off near the door, and the TV remote lay between them on the couch. Nothing about the scene looked like someone who was just about to leave. I nodded slowly, pretending to accept her explanation. I walked past them into the kitchen, my legs feeling strangely weak. I could hear them whispering behind me, their voices too low to make out but urgent enough to confirm what my instincts were screaming. I stood at the sink, staring at the clean dishes, trying to steady my breathing. Part of me wanted to storm back into the living room and demand answers. Another part was terrified of what those answers might be. A few minutes later, Santa appeared in the kitchen doorway, her smile back in place like a mask she had quickly pulled on. "I should go," she said lightly. "I didn't know you'd be home." I forced a smile in return. "Yeah, see you later." She hugged me before leaving, her arms wrapped around me tightly, as if she was trying to prove something. I hugged her back out of habit, but my mind was racing. As soon as the door closed behind her, the apartment felt eerily silent. Armin avoided my gaze for the rest of the afternoon. He busied himself in the bedroom, claiming he had work emails to catch up on. I sat on the couch where they had been sitting earlier, staring at the indent their bodies had left in the cushions. The air still carried a faint trace of Sana's perfume. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the way they had looked at each other when I walked in. Guilty, surprised, exposed. It wasn't the reaction of two people caught doing something innocent. It was the reaction of people who had been hiding something and had just been caught off guard. The next few days were a blur of tension and forced normalcy. I watched them more closely than ever, noticing every glance they exchanged, every private smile. I began checking Armin's social media late at night while he slept beside me, scrolling through his messages with a mixture of dread and determination. At first, I found nothing obvious. Their conversations were mostly harmless memes, jokes, discussions about Santa's job search. But there were gaps in the chat history, long stretches of time where no messages appeared even though I knew they had been communicating. The truth revealed itself by accident again. One evening, Armin left his laptop open on the dining table while he went to shower. A notification popped up in the corner of the screen, a messaging app I didn't recognize. My hands trembled as I moved the mouse to keep the screen from going dark. The app opened to a conversation already in progress with Sana. At first, the messages looked casual, similar to what I had seen before. Then I scrolled up. I felt my stomach drop as the tone shifted from friendly to intimate. There were inside jokes I didn't understand, late-night confessions about feeling lonely, and lines that blurred the boundary between family and something else entirely. My breath caught in my throat when I saw a message from Sana that read, "I wish things were different. You know I would have chosen you first if I had the chance." Armin's reply came seconds later. "Sometimes I think about that too." My vision blurred as tears filled my eyes, but I kept reading, unable to stop myself. There were references to meetings at the cafe whose receipt I had found, mentions of moments when I had been at work or visiting our parents alone. They spoke in half-sentences and coded language, but the meaning was clear enough to shatter whatever fragile hope I had been clinging to. By the time Armin returned from the shower, wrapped in a towel and humming under his breath, I was still sitting at the table, his laptop open in front of me. I didn't bother to hide what I had seen. He froze when he noticed the screen. For a second, fear flickered across his face. Then, just as quickly, it hardened into something defensive. "You went through my messages?" he asked, his voice sharp. I laughed weakly, the sound breaking into a sob. "That's what you're worried about right now." He ran a hand through his wet hair, pacing across the room. "You shouldn't have done that. It's an invasion of privacy." "Invasion of privacy," I repeated, my voice rising. "You're having secret conversations with my sister behind my back, and you're talking about privacy." His jaw tightened. "It's not what you think." I turned the laptop toward him, pointing at the screen. "Then tell me what it is. Because it looks a lot like the two of you have been lying to me for months." Before he could respond, my phone buzzed on the table. Sana's name lit up the screen, followed by a message, "Did she find out?" The world seemed to tilt around me. I held up the phone so Armin could see. His face drained of color. In that moment, there was no more pretending, no more half-truths or excuses. The secret they had tried to keep hidden had finally surfaced, and I was standing in the middle of the wreckage, realizing that the two people I had trusted most had built an entire second reality behind my back, one where I was nothing more than an obstacle in their way. The silence after Sena's message appeared on my phone felt heavier than any argument could have been. Armin stood frozen in the middle of the room, his eyes darting between the laptop screen and my face, as if searching for the right words to undo what had already been exposed. I waited, my hands trembling in my lap, but he said nothing. The only sound in the apartment was the faint hum of the ceiling fan and the rapid thudding of my own heartbeat in my ears. "So," I said finally, my voice hoarse. "Are you going to tell me the truth now?" He exhaled slowly, rubbing his face with both hands. "It's complicated," he muttered, avoiding my gaze. I let out a bitter laugh. "No, it's actually very simple. You and my sister have been talking behind my back, meeting in secret, and sending each other messages you definitely wouldn't send if everything was innocent." He shook his head, his expression shifting from guilt to irritation. "You're twisting things. We were just talking. She was going through a tough time, and I was helping her." "Helping her?" I repeated. "Be telling her you sometimes wish things were different. By meeting her at cafes and hiding it from your wife." His lips pressed into a thin line. "You're overreacting." Those words hit harder than anything else he could have said. I stared at him, waiting for him to realize what he had just done. Dismissed my pain, my shock, my entire reality, as if it were nothing more than a tantrum. "I'm overreacting," I whispered. "I just found out my husband and my sister have been lying to me for months." He crossed his arms, retreating into the same defensive posture he used whenever he felt cornered. "You went through my private messages. That says more about you than it does about me." For a moment, I couldn't breathe. The betrayal was already suffocating, but the way he twisted the situation to make me the villain made it even worse. It was as if the ground beneath my feet had disappeared, and he was blaming me for falling. Before I could respond, my phone rang. Sena's name flashed across the screen again. My hands shook as I answered, putting the call on speaker without even thinking. "What did you tell her?" Sena's voice came through, sharp and anxious. She hadn't even bothered to greet me. "I didn't tell her anything," Armin said quickly, stepping closer to the phone. "She saw the messages." There was a pause on the other end, followed by a long, shaky sigh. "Of course she did," Sana muttered. "I told you we should have been more careful." I felt something inside me shatter at the casual way she said it, as if they were discussing a minor inconvenience instead of the destruction of my marriage and my trust. "So you're not even going to deny it?" I asked, my voice cracking. "You're just gonna talk about being more careful next time." Another silence. Then Sana spoke again, her tone softer but no less hurtful. "It's not what you think. It just happened." That phrase, "just happened," made my stomach twist. As if betrayal were a random accident, like slipping on a wet floor or spilling a glass of water. "You're my sister?" I said, the words trembling as they left my mouth. "You were at my wedding. You helped me pick my dress. You stood next to me and promised you'd always protect me." "I didn't plan this," she replied quickly. "We didn't mean for it to go this far." "How far has it gone?" I demanded. Neither of them answered immediately, and their silence was louder than any confession. I hung up the phone before either of them could say another word. My hands were numb, my chest tight, and for a moment I thought I might actually collapse. Instead, I stood up slowly and walked into the bedroom. Armin followed me, his footsteps hesitant. "What are you doing?" he asked as I pulled my suitcase from the closet. I didn't look at him. "I'm leaving." "You can't just leave," he said, his voice rising. "We need to talk about this like adults." I let out a hollow laugh as I started folding clothes with clumsy hands. "You should have thought about acting like an adult before you started sneaking around with my sister." He grabbed my wrist, forcing me to stop. "You're being dramatic." I yanked my hand away, my patience finally snapping. "Of course I'm being dramatic, Armin. My husband is emotionally cheating on me with my own sister. What reaction were you expecting? A thank you card. His expression hardened, and for the first time since I had known him, I saw something cold in his eyes. If you leave now, you're just going to make everything worse. Our families will find out. People will talk. The implication was clear. He wasn't worried about hurting me, he was worried about appearances. That realization made my decision easier. I hope they do find out, I said quietly, zipping up my suitcase. Because I'm not going to keep your secret. I left the apartment that night with nothing but a suitcase and a heart that felt like it had been crushed into dust. I went straight to my parents' house, driving with blurred vision and shaking hands. I kept rehearsing what I would say, imagining my mother's shocked gasp, my father's anger on my behalf, the comfort I thought they would give me. Instead, when I told them everything, the room filled with a different kind of silence. My mother sat down heavily on the couch, pressing her hand to her chest, as if she were the one who had been wronged. My father paced back and forth, his face tight with frustration. Are you sure you didn't misunderstand something? My mother asked finally, her voice cautious. I stared at her in disbelief. I saw their messages, Amy. I walked in on them together. What is there to misunderstand? She exchanged a glance with my father, then sighed. Your sister says you're exaggerating. She said you've been stressed lately, and you might be reading too much into things. It felt like being betrayed all over again. So you're taking her side? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. We're not taking sides, my father said quickly. We're trying to keep this family from falling apart over something that might just be a misunderstanding. A misunderstanding, I repeated, my chest tightening. He told her he sometimes wished things were different. She said she would have chosen him first. How is that a misunderstanding? My mother rubbed her temples. Even if they crossed a line, you're still married. These things can be worked through if you're patient. I looked at them. The people I had always believed would protect me, and realized that they were more concerned with preserving the image of a perfect family than with the pain their daughter was in. That night, I lay awake on the same bed I had slept in as a child, staring at the familiar cracks in the ceiling. I had left my home, lost my husband, and somehow managed to lose my family's support in the same breath. The world I had built for myself was gone, and in its place was a hollow emptiness I didn't know how to fill. But somewhere beneath the heartbreak and shock, a quiet, stubborn voice began to grow, whispering that if no one else was going to stand up for me, I would have to learn how to do it myself. The weeks after I moved back into my parents' house passed in a blur of tension, whispers, and forced normalcy. On the surface, life carried on as if nothing significant had happened. My mother still cooked dinner every evening, my father still watched the news in the living room, and Santa still came by on weekends like she always had. The only difference was that now, when she walked through the door, I was no longer the sister who ran to hug her. I stayed in my room, listening to her laughter echo down the hallway, each sound twisting like a knife in my chest. They acted like the situation would fix itself if we all pretended hard enough. Whenever I tried to bring it up again, my parents would change the subject or tell me to give things time. Santa, for her part, avoided being alone with me. When we did cross paths, she'd offer small, careful smiles as if we were distant acquaintances rather than sisters who had once shared everything. Armin tried to contact me constantly during those first few weeks. He called, texted, even showed up outside my parents' house one evening, standing awkwardly near the gate like a stranger. I refused to see him. The thought of facing him again made my stomach churn with equal parts anger and humiliation. Each time my phone lit up with his name, I felt a familiar ache in my chest, but I forced myself to ignore it. I knew that if I answered even once, I might be dragged back into the same web of excuses and half-truths he had spun so easily before. Eventually, the calls slowed. Then they stopped altogether. It was my cousin Nadia who first hinted that things were not as stable on their side as my parents were pretending. She called me one afternoon under the pretense of checking on me, but her voice carried the nervous excitement of someone who had news to share. I ran into Sana at the mall yesterday, she said carefully. She was with Armin. My grip tightened around the phone. Of course she was, I replied flatly. They didn't look comfortable, Nadia continued. They were arguing. Loudly. People were staring. A strange mix of emotions washed over me. Part of me felt vindicated, proof that the perfect little story they were trying to maintain wasn't holding up. Another part of me felt a dull, lingering sadness. I had once imagined Armin and Sana laughing together because they loved me. Now they were fighting because of what they had done to me. More stories began to trickle in over the following weeks. A neighbor mentioned seeing Armin moving some of his things out of our apartment. A mutual friend messaged me, hesitantly asking if the rumors about him and my sister were true. Apparently, they had been seen together often enough that people had started talking. The truth, which my parents had tried so hard to keep contained within the walls of our home, was slipping out into the world on its own. One evening, my mother came into my room with a troubled expression. She sat on the edge of my bed, smoothing the blanket in that nervous way she had whenever she didn't know how to start a difficult conversation. "Your aunt called," she said softly. "She asked if you and Armin were separating." I closed the book I had been pretending to read. "What did you tell her?" "I said you were going through a rough patch," she replied, her voice defensive. "There's no need to air our problems to everyone." I stared at her, exhausted. "They already know Ami. People have seen him and Sana together. You can't hide this forever." Her shoulders sagged slightly, and for the first time since everything had happened, I saw uncertainty in her eyes. The illusion she had been clinging to was finally starting to crack. A few days later, Sana tried to talk to me directly. I was in the kitchen pouring myself a glass of water when she walked in, closing the door behind her. The air between us felt heavy with all the words we hadn't said. "We need to talk," she said, her voice trembling slightly. I leaned against the counter, my arms crossed. "About what?" "How you and my husband couldn't help falling in love." Her face flushed. "It's not like that." "Then explain it to me," I said. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks exactly like that." She looked down at her hands, twisting her fingers together. "He told me you were drifting apart. That you didn't understand him anymore. We just started talking more, and he made me feel seen." The words felt like salt rubbed into an open wound. "So you decided the best way to feel seen was to betray your own sister." Tears welled in her eyes, but I felt no sympathy. "I never wanted to hurt you," she whispered. "But you did," I replied, my voice steady. "And you kept doing it every time you met him behind my back." Before she could respond, my father called her from the living room, and she left the kitchen without another word. The conversation ended just like every other attempt at honesty in our family, unfinished and unsatisfying. The real turning point came about 2 months after I had left Armin. I was scrolling through social media late at night when I saw a photo posted by one of Sana's friends. It showed Sana and Armin sitting together at a restaurant. His arm draped casually over the back of her chair. The caption was a simple heart emoji. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at the screen. They weren't even trying to hide it anymore. By morning, the photo had spread through our extended family's group chats. My phone buzzed constantly with messages, some from relatives asking if I was okay, others expressing shock or disapproval. The carefully constructed narrative that I had overreacted and misunderstood everything was falling apart in real time. At breakfast, my father sat unusually quiet, his newspaper untouched. My mother kept glancing at her phone, her face pale. Finally, she looked up at me, her eyes filled with a mix of guilt and regret. "They shouldn't have done this publicly," she muttered, more to herself than to me. I set my cup down slowly. "It was always public, Amy. You just refused to see it." Later that day, Armin showed up at the house again. This time, my parents didn't stop me from speaking to him. Perhaps they finally realized that avoiding the truth had only made things worse. He stood in the doorway, looking tired and unshaven, a far cry from the composed man I had married. For a brief moment, seeing him like that stirred a flicker of the love I had once felt. Then I remembered the messages, the lies, the way he had called me dramatic for reacting to his betrayal. "What do you want?" I asked coldly. He swallowed hard. Things have gotten out of control. People are talking. Sena's getting a lot of hate online, and my parents are furious. I thought maybe we could tell everyone this was a misunderstanding. That we're trying to work things out. I stared at him in disbelief. Even now, he was more concerned with reputation than with the damage he had caused. You want me to lie for you? I asked quietly. It's not lying, he insisted quickly. It's just simplifying things. I shook my head slowly. No. I've been silent long enough. That evening, for the first time since everything had started, I told my side of the story openly. I spoke to relatives who called, answered their questions honestly, and stopped protecting the people who had never protected me. Each word felt like a weight lifting off my chest. The truth, once hidden in secret messages and hushed conversations, was finally out in the open, and with it came a strange, unexpected sense of relief.